there's a whole philosophical tangle
Yeah.
there that people have been struggling with for a long time that's more in your wheelhouse than mine.
Okay, so I'll start the timer now for 5 hours, something like
There we
that.
go. I don't know. I think it's been a few thousand years, honestly, that we've been worrying about this.
Oh, yeah, but I'm really good. I can get it down to
Okay.
5 hours. Yeah. This is Philosophy, Programs, and Prompts, a podcast where two real humans make contact with mysterious technological entities. Dare we say, aliens? I'm Casey Hart.
I'm Carl Brown.
And yeah, welcome to the show today, people. We want to kick off with, we're going to talk a lot about aliens, but beforehand, I want to make sure that Carl is as frustrated and angry and as saddened as possible. So yeah, before we kicked off recording, we were talking, and it's got you kind of down, Carl. You want to?
Yeah, so I'm concerned that there are so many people in the group of people in society that have enough extra money to be doing investments. I'm concerned that so many of them are so willing to believe that we're on the cusp of this, promised AI revolution, that there's just not a lot of evidence for the economic benefit of any of this so far. There's this belief that AI is going to be so revolutionary that there's going to be some ROI at some point down the road. And there's some amount of sentiment even amongst, Sam Altman from OpenAI has even admitted that, there's some amount of speculative bubble going on. And it looks like people are way more willing to shovel money on speculation than I hoped or expected. And it's just kind of bumming me out.
Yeah. And there are multiple interpretations for why people are willing to make that investment, right? Like on the one hand, it could be that there are more people that are optimistic about this, and we don't think that they ought to be so optimistic. So that's got us down. The other way might be the people who are investing don't actually have the optimism that the stuff's going to work, but they think that there are other people who are going to be optimistic enough, or that the government's going to save it if too big to fail or something like that. And so they think they can still, make money or bail on this before stuff goes up in smoke. So, and none of those are good, right?
Right.
And I also worry about it, especially in a time when, so there were some big stories in the preceding weeks with graduations and stuff like that,
Right.
about, commencement speakers, actually usually, it was commencement speakers,
Yep.
usually not the students, but who say, oh, you guys have to learn how to use AI, and there's,
booze and
so much disdain. Like, I think there's public sentiment is not at an all-time low for AI, but it is going down pretty sharply. There's some hatred of data centers and NIMBYism and don't take all of our jobs. While at the same time, you pair that with this economic optimism. I don't know what the right term is, but crazy valuations that seem AI centered. And that doesn't feel tenable to me, or pretends a little more of a dystopian future. I think it's worth having this banter on a channel where we are going to be often saying like, things aren't as crazy or as bad as people are making them seem, or like this hype is blown out of proportion. And here's a place where like both of us really are worried and unsettled about where this stuff is shaken out.
Yeah, there's an extent to which I fundamentally don't want to live in a world where the current ability of AIs to create things is good enough. Because in my experience, the things that AIs are creating now, and in the future, who knows? But, we're not seeing evidence that these things have stopped hallucinating, that they're reliable. We're still seeing lots of lawyers sanctioned because they filed briefs that were hallucinating law cases that they, didn't catch, and that kind of thing. And if that kind of output is good enough to be used according to a large percentage of the population, that's not a world that I think is going to be fun, because it means there's going to be lots and lots and lots of bugs and software problems and things that are going to impact real people. But it doesn't look like the people that are investing are worried about that or care about that, which I just find unfortunate.
Well, and you say real people as if these AI agents are not themselves real people. And that is kind of the discussion that we're going to have today. So transition away from that banter and into talking about some AI aliens. And lest people who are listening to this episode think that I'm making this up, right? I want to sort of establish a baseline here that we have a foil that actually exists out there. So I wrote 3 in my notes. You can find a ton more. Maybe you'll have some other that you want to reference, Carl. But number 1, and this is one that I came across. It's a TED Talk by Mustafa Suleymon. I feel like I'm butchering the last name. It's Suleiman. And he was the head of AI at Microsoft or something like that a little while back. Might still be today. I should be more tapped in, but that's the point of this podcast, is we don't have to get all of our details perfectly right. And his TED Talk, he was talking about how do we think about understanding AI? Like, what is AI? And I was going over this a lot when I made a series on what is AI on my own YouTube channel. And I was like, oh, this will be an easy, first thing to check off. Turns out it wasn't. And his suggestion is that AI, it's not a whole bunch of other things that you would think. The best metaphor is that AI is a new digital species. And he thinks that whatever we say about AI, we need to be able to explain to even 6-year-olds. And I'll just read a little bit from the transcript here so you get the context. But he says, we should, I think, be able to easily describe what it is we're building, and that includes 6-year-olds. So it's in this spirit I offer up today the following metaphor for helping us to try to grapple with what this moment really is. I think AI should be best understood as something like a new digital species. And he tells us not to take that too literally and do some other things, but really we should think about engaging with a new type of creature. That's the kind of thing that he has in mind. So that's the Suleiman view. Then another metaphor that comes up and a description as AI being like a very different sort of thing than just mere technology comes from Nate Soares, who wrote the book with Eliezer Yudkowsky, If Anyone Builds It, Everybody Dies. And in his conversation with Hank Green, he distinguishes AI as and these LLMs as being grown and not built. And we'll talk more about what that means later. But this grown but not built thing comes up a ton. And then I was looking for more citations just to make sure, okay, are those the only 2 that I have? And there's just tons of articles out there. Another one, which we can drop below in the description, is the title of the video is that this isn't just AI, it's alien intelligence. It's like an hour-long documentary. And this is par for the course, right? Lots of people are talking about these things as alien, as grown entities, as new digital species. And that's the topic we want to cover today. So before we get into, we're going to hit each of those separately and talk about digital persons and stuff like that. But I want to get into a bit, why are people discussing it in this way? What is the conversation in the dialectic like that people are using this vocabulary?
So my guess is that there's some amount of aggrandizing. We talked in the bit about AI doomers a few episodes ago, that there's a lot of attempts to basically puff up the idea of how important and how huge AI is going to be. That leads it to be more likely to be invested in, for people to be more scared of it, for people to be more worried about, whether or not China is going to get there first, that kind of thing. And conflating it with aliens, I think, is another way of scaring people, basically. As we're recording this, I haven't seen it yet, but Steven Spielberg's Disclosure Day released not long ago.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too.
And it was supposedly this huge idea that, what is the world going to do at the point when there's proof that aliens exist? And it's like, okay, well, if the idea is that the onset of large language models is the same kind of impact as the proof that aliens actually exist, that's a very significant change to everybody's worldview and lifestyle and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, you'll definitely see that in any of the conversations where these metaphors or descriptions of AI come up. It's a conversation about how crazy impactful these things are going to be. Important to note so far, we'll push back on these metaphors, I think, as we go, or at least that's what I intend to do. Maybe you'll love them, and I'll be surprised.
Not so much.
But I think everything that you've said so far is consistent with what Suleiman and Soares and others would say, right? Soares does think that we should be freaked out and scared about these things. Like we're using that language specifically to wake people up to how impactful AI is and why we need to be regulating it or worried about it, right? The title of his book is sensational. He thinks it's not too sensational, but like it's to get people's attention. The other thing that I think comes to mind here for a lot of these, and especially the alien part, is even if it's not about the impact, it's to get people to understand that this is a very different thing from what you're used to thinking about. Like to have some sort of, gestalt shift to don't think about this like just any other technology. And part of that can be marketing as well, right? Like this isn't, Swiffer is not just any other mop. It's a whole new kind of thing. Maybe that's what we should be thinking here. And we'll talk more about different types of technology and how this lines up with it. But yeah, I think that's the dialectic here. One other piece where people bring this up, though, is to think about rights. Okay, these are grown things that are much like persons. And that doesn't just mean we should be scared of them or think about them differently, but we should not be cruel to them. We should give them their rights, right? So there's a sort of a philosophical way of thinking about these things that we'll hit as well.
The other thing that it does is it implies that these things have agency, right? And if the AI does something and that something is bad, right? And somebody, there are trying to not trigger the algorithm. There are lawsuits that AI has encouraged teenagers to, commit, irrevocable self-harm, that if the AI has agency, then it's the AI's fault, not the company's fault. Right. And so the more that you can frame these things as being beings, there's got to be a better way to say that, but the more that you can frame these things as having their own minds and having their own initiative and having their own agency, then the more that they become responsible for whatever it is that they do, and the less that the company is culpable for sticking software out there that is trying to encourage people to do things that are harmful to them.
That's right. Yeah. In the same way that, some people who do slander or libel or whatever, but they can get out of it because their show is like intentionally comedic or something, right? You're saying the nature of the product is such that I can lie a little bit, right? If the nature of your product is that you're building something that acts on its own, then of course we can't be held liable for all of the things that product does. Like that's just, it's built in. So let's talk about the grown versus built thing, because this I have more questions for you about. I guess first I just want to understand what is the case that someone would make? Why do we think that these AI are grown and not built?
So what happens is they build this neural network. Basically, it's a computer algorithm or set of computer algorithms that are inspired by a really, 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 really oversimplified idea of what a brain might do, right? And they take this really oversimplified view of how a brain might work. They make it huge in terms of the number of different parameters is what they call it. But basically the idea is trying to emulate a really crazy high number of neurons connected to each other in random ways. And then they train it by throwing a bunch of data in one side and then seeing what they get on the other side and saying, no, that wasn't right. Yes, this was right. No, that wasn't right. Yes, this was right. And then the feedback mechanism basically changes a bunch of the parameters around inside the model. And their argument is basically because we train it with a bunch of things on one side, and then we reinforce the things that are correct on the other side, and we disincentivize it to do the things that are incorrect. That what we're doing basically is growing the thing. I've seen them say, we don't understand how it works and all that kind of stuff. First off, let me say, do you have any questions or comments about that?
I think so. So let me try and put it a little bit in my own words. You can say if I have some misapprehensions here. So we have like this neural net model, right, which we have these different nodes in it, and we've got some like intermediate neurons, and they're associated with like mathematical functions. I know there's a variety we get, and then we run it through and we get some parameters. And as we're running it through, and it's just doing this in an automated way, the generation of those parameters then builds up like a vector space, right? That's the kind of thing that we have in the model that's serving these large language models. And what they're saying by the grown not built is that for any given parameter, so if I have a word, right, like, infatuation, and it's got this, 100 place vector space or 1,000 space vector space, no one who made that model has any idea what the 73rd value in that string of vector space means. That's kind of what they mean by like, we let some stuff run, we ended up with product at the other end, and it's pretty much a black box to us. But is it also fair to say, this is the thing that bothered me about that, if I really wanted to, I could follow the process and figure out why that number was 73. Now, I don't know what the 73rd number was. Now, maybe it would take 15 million calculations, and so it's practically very difficult for me to get there. But I could build a small model, and I could calculate all this by pencil and paper, right? We understand the mechanism to that degree, right?
I mean, there's actually a guy who works for IBM in the UK. I'll stick a link to his stuff in the description, but he's actually created an LLM query language where you can actually query the thing like a database. It's really interesting. I've been trying to put together a video on it, but it's really complicated. And trying to put it together in a simplified form so that people can kind of understand what's going on is really difficult. But fundamentally, just understand that there's a way, if you spend enough time on it and you dissect the parameters enough, there's a way that you can actually use this software to query an LLM and ask it for this particular thing, show me the connections to this and all that kind of stuff. So, it's not impossible for us to understand what's going on. It's just that, one, the total amount of time that it takes to figure out what paths through this thing were relevant or not relevant for any given question is much greater than the amount of time it took to ask and to answer that question. And we're not capable of tracing every one of those queries because we barely have enough CPU to serve all of the requests that people are making. If we tried to actually trace everyone too, it would be, it's computationally prohibitive. It would just be it would slow everything down way too much. The companies wouldn't stand for that. So we can do it. It's just the amount of effort it would take to do it is way greater than any company is willing to do. And so they say that, we can't, meaning we can't at the times of scales that they are willing to go. And then remember that the ability to query a model is a function of what you know about that particular model and how it was, the artifacts of it being trained. And so by the time you get to the point on a really large model that you've figured out, okay, how is this whole thing hooked together? Then the new version is out, right? And all of the work that you've done to understand that particular version doesn't apply to the next version, and you have to start over every time. So it just isn't practical to try to figure out what's going on inside of them, as they would say. But in fact, it's possible. It's just not practical.
So if we return, to be fair to those who are saying they're grown, not built, they're often not saying it's impossible. Sometimes they are, but let's be as charitable as we can and say maybe they think, sure, it's possible to figure out like why any single thing ended up where it was, but it's still correct to describe it as being grown rather than built. How do you feel about that as a description?
So we in the software industry have a lot of different things that start out as basically a kind of an empty shell, right? You have a database, you start up the database, there's nothing in the database, right? And then you go through some process and you go and you grab, people's, names and phone numbers, or you grab, lat and longs of different buildings, or you grab, what stores exist at what places or whatever, and you populate this database with whatever kind of data that you want to query, right? And then you ask it questions and you get answers back, right? What they're talking about is if that kind of a database is grown, right? And I can, it's like I guess that's not the absolute worst word that you could use for that. We don't usually call it that. But there's a sense in which for, especially internet scale kind of things so imagine Google search back before Gemini, right? Back before the AI things at the top. There was this index. So basically Google went and scraped the entire web, right? Or imagine like DuckDuckGo, right? Which does the same kind of thing, but doesn't have the AI involved. Basically you query or you go and you hit every web page on the web, or as many as you can in a given period of time, and you copy what the output of that web page is, and you go stuff it in an index somewhere, right? And you figure out what words are there and all that kind of stuff, right? And then when someone says, hey, find the page for, such and such, right? It goes and it looks in the index and it says, okay, what pages are relevant to this, and pulls out the top and hands them to you, right? In that kind of a scenario, you're talking about, millions of gigabytes of information, right? Millions of terabytes of information. If you were to ask someone, okay, which sector of which one of the disks in this cluster of things that answered that query contained the answer for that, they don't know. There's no reason to try to know, right? And you could find that out. You can write a bunch of code to trace the way that the query works and figure out, okay, so this is exactly where that came from. But it's not a thing that is easy to do. It's not a thing that's useful to do, really. But what they're saying is that process, which is a thing that we do all the time, is create these databases, create these corpuses that we're going to query, and we don't know and don't care about exactly where this particular string landed on disk or whatever, because it doesn't matter. But what they are saying is basically the idea that we don't know exactly which parameter, exactly which number was relevant in this particular query means that it's, we don't understand it, and we don't understand how it works, and it's grown, it's not built, and we didn't really do it, and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, software people deal with that all the time. We just don't make a big deal out of it because there's no reason to. They're willfully taking a fairly common practice in software, and they're trying to conflate that with some idea of biology. The other thing to understand is that, so when you're talking about something like, DuckDuckGo querying the entire internet, right? There's the parts of that are the algorithm, right? There are the parts of that are the code that are like, okay, how do I go look things up? How do I take the results from different machines and put them together to make it faster? How do I rank them? That kind of thing, right? And then you have a bunch of the blocks of data on disk that was the index that says, okay, this particular word appeared on, this list of, a billion pages or whatever, right? We know how the algorithm works. We know how the code works. We just don't necessarily know which disk, which piece of things is where the data actually landed, right? Well, in the AI case, they're intentionally conflating those two, right? So they're talking about how we don't know, what the code is doing. It's like, well, we know if you treat all of the different parameters in the model as if they're as if they're actually code, right? Instead of treating them as if they're just a thing that you go look up, the same way you go and look up, what web pages corresponded to this particular word, then we wouldn't know how that code works. But that's not how things work, right? You've got your algorithm, we understand that. And then you've got your data, and we don't know necessarily where each piece of data lives, but we don't need to. And they're trying to put all of that together and say, because of all of this, we don't understand how the code works. And we don't understand how the code works because we don't actually understand what all the different values are. Well, that's not the code. That's just the data that's being queried. And we don't need to know. We don't, how that data is laid out is not relevant to the way the algorithm works and the way the code actually works, the same way that exactly which one of the servers contains the web page that's going to be at the top of the query is not relevant to the code that DuckDuckGo uses in order to figure out which web page is going to be at the top of your list of
Good.
the
Okay.
answer to your question.
That makes a lot more sense. So it's like simultaneously, and this is always the trick when someone is conflating some stuff and being sort of a little fast and loose. They can often defend themselves because whenever you criticize one piece, they're like, oh, it's actually the opposite, right? So if you say, oh, well, we actually do understand where the numbers come from or something like that, we understand the algorithm, then they could try and retreat to, well, sure, we understand that process, but we don't know what that particular number stands for semantically or something like this, like that they can hide in the data instead of the code. It strikes me when you're describing that, like I write for loops. I'm not a super advanced coder, but when I write a for loop and it generates text, right, at each level, in some sense, the thing that I'm producing was grown, right, and not built, if we want to be as permissive as we can about that. Like I didn't keystroke out what the strings were that generated this particular bit of data. Like it's, in a sense, that's grown.
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing to understand is that, so these large language models have this idea of a parameter called a temperature, right? And you turn the temperature up, and what that does is that makes the output more creative, they say. Basically, what that is it's a random number generator, right? And it turns out that if you put a random number generator in your code, then it's really hard to know what it's going to spit out because it's random because you told it to be, right? And so, yeah, it's hard to predict exactly what it's going to do because you put a random number generator in there. The fact that there is a random number generator means it doesn't spit out the exact same thing every time you ask it a question, and that's good from from what they're trying to accomplish, right? But saying, oh, well, that means we don't know what it's going to say, we don't know how it's going to say. It's like, yeah, because it's going to pick a random number, and we don't know what the random number is going to pick. If you turn the temperature all the way down so that it always picks whatever the most likely next word is in the thing that it's trying to spit out, then you can predict exactly what it's going to say because you took the random number out of the equation,
right,
or out of the algorithm.
Yeah, and like you said, this is so much of the stuff here is not a criticism of LLMs or AI generation, right? Like it does some fantastic stuff by being able to iterate through. We think they're super useful, and like you just said, having random number generation as part of it to change the temperature is part of what makes conversing with them feel more natural. Because if deterministic systems that say the same thing every time to the same prompt, that's, it's not quite the way it works. There are some humans in my life who are like that. They're like, I know I can get them to say a story. Like if I have a certain trigger, right? But like you want a little bit of variation. That stuff is good.
Yeah.
I guess it's also say there's some good caution here in the grown, not built piece, right? And I think this holds for anything like that you have procedurally generated, right? Or generated by more for loops, or that are sort of like farther removed from having the engineer specifically code in the values, which is that there's just more space for stuff to happen that we don't foresee. And sometimes that's cool and useful, like emergent behavior. And sometimes we just didn't realize that there was a bug in the code that led to aberrant or bad behavior. And someone who's emphasizing that large language models or whatever AI you like are grown in this sense, that is, that they're far removed from sort of what the initial programmers could be expected to like compute in their heads, let's say, then that's reason for me to be maybe a little more skeptical and impressed by the outputs of. Like, I think that's totally fair. Like, that's part of why ChatGPT was so freaking cool, was that it did some stuff that people really didn't see coming, and a lot of the outputs were really good. Like, some of that stuff is more impressive in virtue of the fact that it's so far removed from what, the original programmers could have immediately foreseen.
Yeah, it's a really cool technology. Effectively, what they've done, this is the way I think about it. They've taken the entire internet. They've done they've created a small approximation of it that's small enough that it can fit on a video card inside of a large computer, right? So this is, taking that, millions and millions of gigabytes of data or terabytes of data, crushing that down into a handful of gigabytes that will fit on a computer and then being able to ask it questions is an incredible technology, right? And
Yeah.
it's really the way we used to say that you have the entire internet in your pocket because you've got a smartphone. Well, you've got the entire internet because you're connected to the entire internet and you can go ask it questions. But in a real kind of way, there's a simplified version of kind of an extract of the entire internet that will actually fit on a large enough phone. And you can ask it questions and you can do it offline. And that's an amazing technology, but it's a search technology. It's not an alien.
Yeah. Yeah. And the last thing I want to say on the grown versus built is there's some idea here that they think people get freaked out by the fact that the thing is grown but not built, right? Like that's what we're going for. My wife is an avid gardener. And like, if we walked out into the garden right now and I was like, see those, 47 some odd fig trees, they were grown and not built. I don't think you would be like, oh my God, I gotta get out of here. Like, I can't be around this many grown, no, like that's pretty reasonable, right? Like there's some, it still confuses me a little bit how spooked out and freaked out we're supposed to be from the fact that there's some stuff that we just kind of put it in motion and kind of let physics and some other things do their work. I don't think the analogy with growth holds very well, both in what's actually happening or in the sort of thing that we should be afraid of. Because another piece for like growing, a fig tree or something from a seed is that you already have the information contained in the seed, right? And that's what's germinating and we're just providing water and soil, stuff like that, and it happens. That doesn't seem at all the kinds of things that are happening here, right? Like, we are the ones providing the data, right, with the internet, say. That was not the seed. We're the ones who write the code that is going to, like, build a neural network to come up with the, right? I don't see what the candidate for the seed would be. So I think if we push on that metaphor, not only is it not scary, but it's even less apt than that I would have thought before analyzing it.
Yeah, there's no original DNA that will the rest of the structure into being or anything, right? It's like we hand coded the thing.
I mean, maybe that's what Emily Blunt is releasing to everybody in the movie. I haven't seen it.
I haven't seen it yet either.
That could be it. It was like, actually, no, these LLMs were seeded by extraterrestrials. And if that's what happened, then Carl and I both recant. We're sorry. They were grown. Okay. On the aliens front, though, let's try and make the case that, so this is related, but I think it's distinct from the grown and not built. When people say this is an alien technology, or we should, think of these things as new creatures, new entities. What do you think the best case is that these LLMs are not human and we should think of them as aliens?
So these LLMs use a incredibly simplified idea of how a brain works. We, as a species, have tried multiple times to map the human brain. There was a project in the 2010s in Europe that spent billions of euros, and they failed because the human mind is just that complicated. But over time, our brains, I'm gonna give away my bias here, but our brains have evolved in several different stages, right? And we know that we've got our amygdalas, and we've got our different hippocampus, and the different parts of our brains that have different functions. That were stress tested over millions of years, and that are very similar to the structures that are found in lower animals. We have these things. You might know more about this than I do, but there's this idea that we have these things called mirror neurons, where when we watch some other person or some other being go through a certain thing, that our brains inherently say, okay, well, if I was in that kind of situation, this is how I would feel, kind of thing. That's kind of responsible for empathy. There's a bunch of stuff that's happening in the human brain or even in a dog's brain that we, don't put in LLMs. Right. None of those structures exist. It's like a tiny, tiny little cube of brain matter in theory that's just multiplied over and over and over and over again. And there's no structure, there's no purpose, there's no, none of those things, no prefrontal cortex, none of that stuff is built in such a way that evolution has pushed us to be over the course of, millions and millions of generations, right? And so the idea that they're not human, I think, is pretty clear, because you can't rely on the thing to have empathy for what the person that it's interacting with is going through, because it doesn't have mirror neurons, right?
Okay.
You can't trust it to realize, oh, if I were to give you that answer, I would be violating a social norm, and I shouldn't do that because it doesn't understand social norms, because, it's not wired to be able to understand that the way that we are. Right.
Okay,
So there's
good.
definitely, a lot of things that we can assume about humans, or even about, dogs and cats, that we can't assume about in a large language model, because it doesn't have any of that stuff that makes human and animal brains function as humans or animals.
Good. So if we think about the structure of these as brains, as, silicon brains, silicon minds, something like that, their architecture is different enough from ours that we're better off viewing them as alien creatures than we are making the mistake of saying they're operating like humans, or even you said with a real anthropocentric mindset, lower creatures, which I don't condone that sort of conversation on this podcast. But another thing I think is coming up with alien discussion, right? And this comes up a lot in the context of language. So when we look at the quote unquote language of thoughts that are coming out of these models, or we see the words that come out of an LLM, people who are cautioning us that they're alien are saying that they're not using language in the same way that we are, or there's no guarantee that they're using language in the same way that we are, right? And this really comes up. This is something that I totally agree with, which is that, the way that the model's built up, we were just talking about that in the grown, not built portion, right? Like, these are ways that mathematical models essentially make sense of the way that language appears in a training data corpus. That is not the same thing, certainly not obviously the same thing, as saying they are using words that mean the same things that it means when I say those words, right? When I talk about sunburn or headbands, and I say those things, and you're like, yeah, that's why Casey has that like white stripe at the top of his forehead after a day playing tennis yesterday, right? The LLM that's using those language need not and have those connotations at all, right? So we should expect the use of language. We should not be surprised when the use of language maybe diverges widely from how we use it.
Well, I mean, you probably have more understanding of the meanings of language and that kind of thing than I do. But yeah, there's no. Well, I mean, so let me turn this back on you. So how do we know that the meaning of headband or sunburn or whatever to me is the same as the meaning it is to you, right? It certainly seems that way.
Yeah.
Right. But there's this idea of like, do you really know that I'm conscious? Do I really know that you're conscious? How do we, that there's a whole, philosophical tangle there that people have been struggling with for a long time, that's more in your wheelhouse than mine.
Good. Okay, so I'll start the timer now for 5 hours, something like that, and go.
I don't know. I think it's been a few thousand years, honestly, that we've been worrying about this.
Oh yeah, but I'm really good. I can get it down to 5 hours. Yeah. So the first problem there, which is like one of the most fundamental problems in philosophy, it's always to like do this with freshmen, is the problem of other minds, right? Like, how do we know that other minds exist? As you pointed out earlier, there's maybe some biological motivations we can have for that, with like mirror neurons. But really, we're doing some kind of bit of reasoning most of the time that says like maybe it's an explanation, like was the simplest explanation of what's going on here, but like physiologically, I'm very similar to you, right? Uh, hair, notwithstanding. Uh, um, and
Give yourself time.
I'll get there. And if we have all of these similarities, what makes more sense? That like I'm the only person here and the rest are like not really persons. They don't really have minds. They're just doing these things. Or does it make more sense and more unifying to say that we all, have our own sort of independent minds and that these different things are operating in similar sorts of ways? And there's not going to be a philosophical argument here that's like, oh, it's proven now, like the problem of other minds is totally solved. Like you can be a solipsist. You can think that I'm the only thing that exists, and you can make a coherent worldview for that. Don't think it's the best one, or I think there are some good arguments to think that there are other persons out there. But that's one approach that you can take. And then we get, even beyond the problem of the mind. Let's accept that you and I have different minds, and we're both using language, and we both utter the same word. We both say headband. We're like, how do we know that those refer to the same sorts of things? And that's where you get into philosophy of language stuff and accounts of meaning. And there are a bunch of competing topics out there. I mean,
and to make it really worse, what about when we're talking about the white and the red, right? How do we know that my understanding of what white looks like is the same as yours, or same with, red or other colors, right?
That's right. And so we can separate out like propositional knowledge so I can say some sentence, right? Like the cat is on the mat, and will we both think that they're the same truth conditions for that? Will we both say that that's true in exactly the same circumstances? In which case we can say something like we understand, we have the same meaning. And then the other thing that you're bringing up is like a qualia sort of thing. Like, when I see red and you see red, or we look at the same object, do we have the same felt, subjective presentation of how all of those things come about? And like, those are all like wildly difficult things to pin down. Again, there's some progress that you can argue has been made with neurological stuff where we can do brain scans. And maybe if I'm looking at something and you're looking at something and the same parts of our brains are lighting up in both of those, that might give us some evidence that we're perceiving things in the same kind of way. But it's tricky at best. And for a lot of this, the strategy comes down to some of the same things you do in epistemology when you're confronted with, say, skepticism. Right? You can have this radical skeptical view that you just don't know anything, and somebody can just push back with like, I have hands. I know I have hands. So there's my starting point. I'm just going to run with that, right? You can do that sort of thing for, look, I know that you have a mind and I have a mind, and we are communicating ideas. It won't be perfect every time, right? There's going to be some mismatch, but I think broadly we're speaking the same language. Another thing that I brought, and I did some videos on this for understanding, but a popular view a little while back in the logical positivist sort of range of things was the Wittgensteinian. So Ludwig Wittgenstein had this view that the meaning of the language is just use, right? So like we play what he calls language games, and if when I say something, you kind of either assent or don't assent to my saying that, right? And if I'm like, oh, this shirt is blue, and you'd be like, that's wrong. I'd be like, oh, I'm not uttering words that sort of line up with the way that you think I should be uttering words, right? And the way we learn language, kind of on that view, is something like that. We say a bunch of things, and people give us the thumbs up or thumbs down. And over time, we sort of evolve to learn the rules of the language game. So then if we put this in the case of, LLMs and stuff like that, if you have a more Wittgensteinian approach, you might even think that LLMs do understand language. If they are uttering the things that we would say are true in the same circumstances, it's playing the game in the same way, and that's all that there is to meaning. But another deeper account, and one that I hold to for meaning, like there has to be some understanding going on, and that requires understanding how these words map on to the way that the world is. Right. And so for me, when I say that like my forehead's white because I wore a headband in the sun, right, part of you understanding that sentence and me understanding that sentence is to know how a bunch of other things could have been different. Like, oh, if Casey like didn't wear the headband, he'd have a more uniform sunburn, or maybe he needed more sunscreen or something like that. Like that would all make sense of that situation. But yeah, it is a complicated a complicated situation. So yeah, the whole account of what it is to understand and what it is to have other minds, like there are a bunch of different views there, and I don't want to be too hand wavy either and say there are a bunch of different views. So I would say I think it's clear that we understand things and we are communicating things, and even though I don't know exactly what that mechanism is, the translation over to the AI case is LLMs are not in touch with reality in the same kind of way that you and I are. And this is where it just sort of comes full circle to what you were saying about, the motivations for thinking that they're alien because they have, they don't have the same sort of brains that we have or dogs have or things like that. LLMs are in touch with the world only like derivatively through being in touch with language use on the internet or something like that in their training data set. That, in a sense, is their perception, right? Whereas your and my perception, like we're hearing these words and like I'm touching this microphone if I want to, like, I get to do all sorts of interventions that they're not capable of doing. But one thing I like about while I don't like the sensationalist nature of calling AI alien to make us, more scared of it, right? There's some sort of, you can't spell alien without A and I, right? But I do like saying that we shouldn't expect AI to process the world in the same kind of way that we do. But then I get worried, and there's always two sides to all of these coins, right? There is, whenever we want to say, like, is AI, super smart? We've done this in past podcasts where you can talk about, like, humans are maybe not as smart as we would like them to be or something. And similarly here, like, is AI super alien to us? Like, well, other humans are pretty alien to us too, right? So in what you were bringing out, how do I know that you're using language exactly the same way that I do? You're probably not. We're using language at least a little bit different. I think that's reasonable. And so if the lesson here is that we should be super worried about AI radically diverging from us, I don't know how much of it, like that's not a new and unique thing. Like I have to be worried about every piece of technology, every book, every other human that I talk about using language maybe differently than I am too, right?
In every other country.
Absolutely.
Right.
So I guess that just has me think like it's the same mode for, grown, not built. Like what other things feel like they're grown? Like what other things feel like they're alien that you might be dealing with? And in just highlighting AI as alien, they're trying to make us maybe forget that there are lots of things that are fundamentally pretty different from us, and we manage to interact with them in not devastating ways.
It's pretty par for the course for the way that they like to describe things is they want to basically take something that's relatively pedestrian, and they want to couch it in the most extreme terms and the most extreme case and contrast it with, the most extreme human case, and say, look how far apart these things are. So obviously, this is a really, really big deal. When in fact there are different interpretations using different words that are just as correct, but that don't lend themselves to the kind of alarmism that they're trying to inflict.
There's a big fallacy here that I think goes, I don't know if it's unnoticed or not to us because we are so sophisticated, and not to our listeners. But when you say that something is very different, and then you attribute to it a bunch of additional and more sophisticated qualities, right? And there's a future podcast that we need to do here on talking about like our AI persons and how should we think about persons, that kind of stuff. We talked about doing it for this episode, and like it would be too much. But when you say that AI is alien, and then they use language in a weird way, a way that we wouldn't do, right? The first move, it's fine to say like, okay, these things are trained up differently than us. They might be using language in a fundamentally different way, or we're not sure how it latches on to reality. And so don't be surprised when that stuff happens. Don't take everything at face value. That is, to me, like 2 thumbs up. Like that's a good and healthy way to think about LLMs as quote unquote alien technologies. The bad way would be like, well, they're alien and they use these words in a way different than I would. So what's the hidden meaning in that, right? Like subliminally, if I just take every third letter and I try and sound something out, or maybe could this be a reference to the Aztec calendar? Like when you start getting into those conversations, then you're going too far. Yeah. So and this is the other thing. I don't think we mentioned this earlier in the dialectic. I think this is important, and maybe it's good not to bring it up in the early, like, why are people talking about things in this way? Because it makes me sound too mean, I think. But a number of people who talk about AI as grown and not built and as alien are conspiracy theorists, right? Like, they like to have some like complex mystery to solve, or something to be, nefarious, or, the Knights Templar structuring things. And it would be, while it's wrong to say that everybody who uses that language is conspiratorial in that kind of way. And don't get me wrong, I think some conspiracy theories are true. Like, I don't think they're false by definition. But even though it's wrong to say that everyone is a conspiracy theorist who says this, it's also wrong to ignore that as a possibility. And I worry that some of the squeakiest wheels on this front are actually some of the most conspiratorial. I won't throw any more shade than that. But yeah, have your skeptical radar out for when people are using this language. It's correlated with some other stuff too. Okay, so we've covered a bunch of stuff. I would like, what are the takeaways? So you hear somebody talking about grown but not built, or AI are aliens. I guess first off, like, summary from Carl, like, is AI grown? Are they alien? Like, what, if we were answering that question, what do you say?
So the code of the AIs, just like the code of DuckDuckGo's non-AI search, is something that we completely understand. The parameters of the model, the things that are, supposedly grown, just like the data that DuckDuckGo has about which web pages have which words on them, are things that can't be predicted in advance, because it's a function of how the AIs are, the words that the AI is seen as they're trained, and how the feedback works, and the way that DuckDuckGo scrapes the web, and how the contents of the web that it scrapes get written to disk. So don't conflate the code and the functionality with the data that the code app operates on, because one of those things is very predictable and the other one is not.
Yeah, beautiful. I get sucked into that conflation all the time, so I'm glad I'm glad you talked about that one today. And then on the alien front, like, yeah, AI is alien in the sense that it's not human, and it will do things that are not necessarily the way that we would do or think about things.
And most importantly, it will not do things that we obviously assume a human would know to do or not to do. Right. So
exactly.
When there was an event where there was a person in San Francisco who got hit by a driverless car, and the driverless car said, "Oh, I need to go get off the road," and so it dragged her over to the curb. Whereas a human would obviously know, I need to not make this any worse, right? But there's no, well, obviously this is how I would want someone to behave in the event that they hit me with a car. That stuff doesn't exist inside of an LLM, because they're not human. They don't have all of that plumbing that's been created for us by evolution over the last however many million years.
Yeah. And this is a lesson that is driven home, like, by anybody who's learned computer programming, right? Is you, like, start telling it to do something, and it does something stupid, and you realize, no, it did exactly what I told it to do. And it's incredibly frustrating when that's not the thing that, like, oh, a smart human would know I'd wanted to have
Right.
this exception case, right? And so in some ways, yeah, again, I'm an Ecclesiastes guy, nothing new under the sun, right? Like, this is, don't think of LLMs and this sort of AI, like, it is novel and cool technology, but there's a lot of existing ways of thinking about things that are really no different.
Yeah, it's really just an incremental search technology on top of a bunch of other search technologies that we've been using for decades now. So don't panic.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us for this hour or so of conversation. We met some aliens, we grew some things, or didn't. I guess it's up to you now.
Yeah, you make up your own mind. We just give you the facts.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.